Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bible study from Dinuba Presbyterian Church. This Lenten season, we are continuing in our series of studies in the book of Hosea, an Old Testament prophet who God called to serve as a living, long-suffering image of the redemptive grace of God. I'm glad you're with us as we look at this fascinating and important book and remember all that God has done for us. Last week, we looked at the connections between Jesus and Hosea, both in the common derivation of their names and how the story of Hosea's life prefigures Jesus. Redemption is the connecting theme of chapters 2 and 3 of Hosea, with God's prophecy of judgment against a faithless Israel, concluding with a promise to rescue and restore them in chapter 2, and a brief narrative interlude in chapter 3, in which Hosea seeks out Gomer, who has wandered again, and redeems her. By now, you are hopefully picking up on the cyclical nature of Hosea and Gomer's relationship and their marriage. Hosea redeems Gomer, Gomer goes astray, and Hosea redeems her again. This repetition within the text is intentional, mirroring the same cycle within the history of God's people that culminated in the death and resurrection of Jesus that we're preparing to celebrate together on Easter Sunday. In Hosea, the great offense of Israel against God is their worship of other gods, usually called idolatry, because those foreign gods were almost always depicted in images of wood or stone called idols. And in this study, we'll focus on this topic of idolatry and its history among God's people. The etymology of the Hebrew word for idol can serve as some instructive background for this discussion, so buckle your seatbelts as we dive into everyone's very favorite topic of biblical languages. Where our English translations say idol, the Hebrew word being translated is asab, which simply means image. On its face, that's not particularly interesting, but the root word from which asab is derived has a much more complex and significant meaning. The root is identically transliterated in English as asab, with different diacritical markings in the Hebrew itself. Most technically, the word means to fashion, to form, to carve. But in usage, the word had a far more symbolic meaning of being aggrieved, of being hurt, of being vexed. The act of carving out the image of a god in wood or stone is, of course, destructive to the original substance being used in a material sense. But in a far more important metaphysical or symbolic sense, fashioning an idol is similarly destructive as an act toward the people's relationship with God. It's an act of betrayal, a breach of the trust between God and his people that reveals that those practicing idolatry don't believe that God is actually who he says he is. The ancient world was awash in idolatry, in images of gods depicted as glorified animals, glorified people, or glorified celestial bodies. When the Hebrew people were enslaved in Egypt, they lived in the constant presence of images of the Egyptian pantheon. Ra, Anubis, Osiris, and others. At the Exodus, when God rescued the people out of their slavery, he established a covenant with them, an agreement about God's responsibilities to the people and the people's responsibilities back to him. Among the stipulations of that covenant were the famous 10 Commandments, which you can read about, of course, in their entirety, in Exodus chapter 20. The first 2 commandments are important to what we're considering. First, the rescued people of God shall have no other gods before him. And secondly, the people of God are not to create any idols. Here is how God expressed it at the giving of the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. And this is Exodus chapter 20, picking up in verse 4. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the 3rd and the 4th generations of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands, or to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. Only the fourth commandment regarding the Sabbath is accompanied by such an extensive discussion. And in fact, the first, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, and 10th commandments have no such attending discussion at all. It's a measure of the seriousness of the issue in God's eyes and the importance of eradicating idolatry from the people's practice. To our modern ears, this sounds like a fairly simple and straightforward proposition. Idolatry will have no place in this new nation of Israel. So no statues, figurines, amulets, decorative poles, or any other images will be permitted. The God who delivered them from slavery in Egypt so miraculously must be worshipped exclusively, meaning no foreign gods should be tolerated within the community's worship. And that same God must not be so denigrated so as to be reduced to the image of something common to nature. On its face, this doesn't sound like a particularly difficult commandment to follow. But it's important to keep in mind that the Hebrew people have been suffering under Egyptian enslavement for 400 years. Their captivity lasted generation after generation as Hebrew people were born, matured, had children, and died under the constant shadow of the Egyptian pantheon and idolatrous practices. As we mentioned before, images of the gods were everywhere, an integral and inescapable fixture of their society. Now, God was commanding them to become iconoclasts as part of their transformation into a new society that would be visibly distinct and different from the rest of the world, including their former Egyptian masters. That's not an easy transition by any means, and it's not surprising that eventually, actually rather quickly, the old ways creeped into Israel's practices long before they settled in the Promised Land. The first instance of idolatry post-Exodus among God's people is also among the most famous. In Exodus 32, while Moses is on Mount Sinai, receiving elaborate instruction from God as to how the tabernacle and its related items are to be designed and constructed, the people grow restless, waiting for Moses to get back. They're afraid he's never going to come back. And they demand that Aaron, Moses' brother, create gods to go before them. Despite the pillar of fire at night and the pillar of cloud during the day that signaled God's presence in the camp with them, the people wanted a more familiar mode of materializing that presence, marking it, and displaying it as a symbol to alert their adversaries and make them think twice about attacking. Aaron is surprisingly obliging and casts a golden calf for the people to venerate and to which they offer sacrifices. Almost instantaneously, Israel's flirtation with dangerous syncretism is on display, as Aaron creates the idol of the golden calf and then declares that their worship of the idol will be a part of a feast day dedicated to Yahweh. It's an unsettling prototype of combining unreconcilable beliefs together that will haunt Israel for centuries to come. When Moses died, the mantle of leadership was placed on Joshua to lead Israel into the Promised Land, where they would face many battles against the peoples of Canaan, who, if you're keeping score at home, practiced idolatry, especially in the form of the storm god Baal and the goddess Asherah. Israel is victorious in these early battles and is able to settle itself into the land God had promised them. But the people groups of Canaan were not eradicated, nor were their religious practices. Joshua foresaw a significant danger of idolatrous practices seeping into God's people by way of marriage to spouses who still worshipped foreign gods. At the end of his life, Joshua issued this warning to the people. And this is Joshua chapter 23, starting in verse 6. Therefore be very strong to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, turning aside from it neither to the right hand nor to the left, that you may not mix with these nations remaining among you, or make mention of the names of their gods, or swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them. But you shall cling to the Lord your God, just as you have done to this day, For the Lord has driven out before you great and strong nations. And as for you, no man has been able to stand before you to this day. One man of you puts to flight 1,000, since it is the Lord your God who fights for you, just as he promised you. Be very careful, therefore, to love the Lord your God. For if you turn back and cling to the remnant of these nations remaining among you, and make marriages with them, so that you associate with them and they with you, know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you, but they shall be a snare and a trap for you, a whip on your sides and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from off this good ground that the Lord your God has given you. Sadly, again, unsurprisingly, Joshua's words were prophetic. The warning that Israel's continued idolatry would lead to judgment at the hands of foreign nations and eventually cause some of God's people to be wiped out from the promised land was busily transitioning from prophecy to reality in the time of Hosea, as the Assyrian invasion of the northern kingdom loomed on the horizon, with the Babylonian conquest of the southern kingdom of Judah lurking close behind. Centuries of incorporating Canaanite idols and religious practices into their worship of God had eroded the foundations of Israel's faith and its understanding of who God is. The covenant was being abandoned. Israel was not fulfilling its oath to follow God and be distinct from the world. It's a pretty dire situation, as Hosea describes in chapter 4. And this is picking up in verse 1. Hear the word of the Lord, O children of Israel, for the Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land. There is no faithfulness or steadfast love, and no knowledge of God in the land. There is swearing, lying, murder, stealing, and committing adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore the land mourns, and all who dwell in it languish, and also the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, and even the fish of the sea are taken away. It's worth mentioning here that we're at a bit of a turning point in the structure of Hosea's text. The narrative elements describing Hosea, Gomer, and their marriage concluded with that short passage in chapter 3 in which Hosea redeems Gomer once again after she had abandoned him for another man. The remainder of Hosea consists of prophecy, but despite its brevity, chapter 3 develops an important theme for the prophetic chapters that follow it. The judgment of Assyria is looming because of Israel's repeated, continued pursuit of idolatry and the worship of foreign gods. Each act of idolatrous worship is a rejection of the covenant and of their mandate to be a light to the nations, a people with a distinct identity and a distinct social practice that will reveal God to a hurting world. Despite their seeming repentance, Israel has turned away again and again, like Gomer, to the point where God no longer hears their cries of repentance because, put simply, he doesn't believe them. In fact, he's growing incredulous by the time we reach chapter 6 of Hosea, which begins with God quoting what Israel is ostensibly saying to him. And this is picking up in chapter 6 in verse 1. Come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us, that he may heal us. He has struck us down, and he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us. On the 3rd day he will raise us up, that we may live before him. Let us know. Let us press on to know the Lord. His going out is sure as the dawn. He will come to us as the showers, as the spring rains that water the earth. God speaking now. What shall I do with you, O Ephraim? What shall I do with you, O Judah? Your love is like a morning cloud, like the dew that goes early away. Therefore I have hewn them by the prophets. I have slain them by the words of my mouth, and my judgment goes forth as the light. For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. But like Adam, they transgressed the covenant. There they dealt faithlessly with me, Gilead is a city of evildoers, tracked with blood. As robbers lie in wait for a man, so the priests band together. They murder on the way to Shechem. They commit villainy. In the house of Israel, I have seen a horrible thing. Ephraim's whoredom is there. Israel is defiled. For you also, O Judah, a harvest is appointed. This issue of this harvest in Judah is one of judgment, but it might have some components of it that are hopeful. And as Hosea's prophecy continues to unfold, we'll be reminded of God's steadfast love and the great truth about the covenant that he made with his people at Sinai. God will never break it. Despite all our faithlessness, God is faithful and always will be faithful, even in the midst of judgment that he pours out upon us. That's paradoxical, perhaps, especially in modern ears, but it's a very important part of the message of Hosea and a truth of the book that we're studying. Next time, we'll continue exploring the concept of idolatry and how it might relate or be terribly misapplied to our modern times. So I hope to see you then. Until then, God bless you, and see you next time.